Cowboy expected a plain bride, but the black woman who arrived shocked him. The weathered rancher's jaw dropped as the elegant woman stepped from the dusty stagecoach, her presence silencing the bustling frontier town. Hostile whispers followed her every step. The townsfolk saw nothing but trouble wrapped in traveling clothes, an outsider destined to be driven out by winter's harsh reality or their own cruelty. They assumed she'd flee within days, another broken dream swallowed by the unforgiving West. But the desperate cattleman needed salvation for his dying ranch. And this mysterious woman carried secrets that could transform his barren land into prosperity. What he didn't know was that her past held both the power to save them and the danger to destroy everything they might build together. Would her hidden truth become their redemption, or would it bring enemies that would tear apart any chance of survival? The Colorado sun beat down mercilessly on Lawson Hargrove's withered cattle. 3 years of drought had turned his once thriving ranch into a graveyard of cracked earth and dying dreams. He knelt beside a fallen calf, its ribs visible through matted hide. The animal's labored breathing matched his own desperation. This was the third one this week, a slow, agonizing march toward ruin. His neighbors had already given up months ago, selling their stock for pennies on the dollar and heading east with their tails between their legs. All except one. Clayton Wade's prosperous spread next door served as a daily reminder of Lawson's failures. Wade's men rode past regularly, their laughter carrying on the dry wind. They'd sit on their horses just beyond his property line, watching his herd shrink, their faces a mixture of pity and smug satisfaction. They whispered about the cursed Hargrove land, about a man too broken to save himself. Lawson's wife, Martha, had died 2 winters past. The fever took her quick, but the loneliness lingered like smoke in a closed room. He'd sealed himself away from the world after that, pouring every ounce of his grief and energy into keeping the ranch alive. It was the only piece of her he had left. Now, even that was slipping through his fingers like desert sand. The bank notice crumpled in his pocket was a constant, burning reminder of the deadline. 2 months, 60 days to settle his debts or lose everything Martha had loved. The thought of strangers walking through their home, their hands on her things, selling off their dreams piece by piece, made his chest tighten until he couldn't breathe. He'd tried hiring help, but no decent man wanted to work a failing ranch. The few drifters who answered his calls took his money and disappeared within days, often with a few of his tools in their saddlebags. He was alone, and he was failing. Desperation drove him to places he'd never imagined going. The mail-order bride advertisement felt like surrendering his last shred of pride. He'd written and rewritten it a dozen times in the dim light of his kerosene lamp, each version sounding more pathetic than the last. He wasn't looking for love, not anymore. He was looking for a partner, a helper. Finally, he'd settled on simple honesty, words that tasted like ash in his mouth. He needed a practical woman, someone plain and hardworking who wouldn't expect romance or fancy promises, someone who understood that survival came before sentiment. He needed a pair of hands, not a heart to mend. The general store buzzed with gossip when he posted the notice on the community board. He could feel their eyes on his back as he hammered the nail. Martha Jennings, the store owner's wife, whispered behind her hand to other customers. Sheriff Collins, a man he'd known his whole life, shook his head with obvious pity. Even the preacher, Reverend Michael, offered unsolicited advice about grieving properly, as if a new wife was a bandage for a broken heart instead of a last-ditch effort to stop the bleeding. Clayton Wade cornered him outside the post office, his expensive boots and silver belt buckles speaking of a success Lawson could barely remember. "You sure this is wise, Hargrove?" Wade sneered, his voice dripping with false concern. "Bringing some desperate woman out to that cursed land." Lawson didn't answer. He just mounted his tired horse and rode away, Wade's mocking laughter following him down the dusty street like a ghost. Weeks passed with no response. Lawson threw himself into the back-breaking work of the ranch, patching fences that barely contained his shrinking herd. The water hole had dropped to nothing more than cracked mud. His vegetable garden, once Martha's pride, produced stunted, bitter crops. Every single morning brought fresh evidence of his failures. He started talking to Martha out in the fields, whispering his fears to the wind, hoping she could hear him, hoping she wasn't disappointed in him. When the letter finally arrived, his hands trembled so badly he could barely break the seal. The paper felt different, expensive. The woman's penmanship was neat, educated, not the scrawl of a desperate farm girl. She agreed to his terms and would arrive on the Thursday stagecoach. Her name was Sophia Reed. She mentioned traveling from back east, but gave few other details about her background. There was no photograph, no long story of woe, just a simple, direct acceptance. It was almost too easy. Lawson spent 3 days cleaning the house, a place that hadn't seen a proper cleaning since Martha passed. He aired out her old dresses, the scent of lavender and mothballs filling the small rooms. He held one up, wondering if it would fit his new bride. The thought felt like a betrayal. Looking in the mirror, he saw a man aged far beyond his 32 years. The sun and worry had carved deep lines around his eyes. His hands, calloused and stained from hard labor, looked like they belonged to his father. He wasn't much of a prize. He knew that. He just hoped she was as plain and practical as he'd requested. Thursday morning found him pacing the depot platform like a caged animal. The stagecoach was late, giving him far too much time to imagine what kind of woman would answer such an advertisement. Probably desperate herself, he reasoned. Maybe widowed with children she couldn't feed. Or too plain to find a husband through normal means. That suited him fine. He needed a work partner, not a beauty who would complicate his already difficult life. The stage finally appeared through the shimmering heat haze, its horses lathered and tired. The usual crowd of townsfolk gathered to see who might emerge. News traveled fast in Cedar Ridge, and everyone knew about Lawson Hargrove's mail-order bride. The driver climbed down, stretching his stiff limbs, and began unloading luggage. A traveling salesman, a drummer, stepped out first, followed by an elderly woman visiting family. Lawson's stomach was a knot of anxiety. He waited, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. Then the door opened again, and she appeared. Sophia Reed was nothing like he'd imagined. She stepped gracefully from the coach, her traveling dress crisp and dark, remarkably clean despite the long journey. Her skin, the color of rich coffee, gleamed in the harsh afternoon sun. She carried herself with a quiet, unshakable dignity, her intelligent brown eyes scanning the crowd without a hint of fear or uncertainty. The platform fell silent, not a cough, not a shuffle of boots. Nothing but the whisper of the hot wind. Lawson felt every single gaze shift from her to him, a wave of shock and disbelief washing over the crowd. His mouth went dry as understanding, then outrage dawned on the gathered faces. Whispers started immediately, a low, venomous hiss that grew louder by the second. Sophia's eyes found his across the dusty platform. She didn't flinch from the hostile stares. She didn't shrink away from the hateful murmurs. She stepped forward with calm, measured confidence, extending a gloved hand. "Mr. Hargrove, I presume?" Her voice was clear and carried a note of education and refinement that was completely out of place in this dusty, dying town. Lawson took her hand automatically, his mind struggling to process this impossible situation. He'd expected plain and practical. He'd gotten elegant, mysterious, and black. Clayton Wade, his face a mask of pure disgust, pushed through the crowd. Other men followed, their expressions ranging from shock to simmering anger. The women clutched their children and pulled their skirts aside as Sophia passed, their whispers turning cruel and sharp. Lawson realized every person on that platform was staring at him, waiting for his reaction, waiting for him to send her back, to reject her, to put things back in their proper order. His decision in the next few moments would determine both their fates. The woman beside him stood perfectly still, her dignity a shield against the venom surrounding them. His failing ranch needed help desperately, he knew that. But bringing this woman home wouldn't just make him an outcast, it would make him a target. The choice would change everything, and there was no going back. The wagon ride to the ranch stretched in an uncomfortable, smothering silence. Sophia sat straight back beside Lawson on the rough wooden seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't speak. She just watched the barren landscape roll past, her gaze taking in the dying cattle and withered crops that told the story of his desperation better than words ever could. Lawson stole glances at her profile. Her calm composure unnerved him more than tears or complaints would have. Any reasonable woman, seeing this desolation, would demand to be taken back to town immediately. She would have screamed or cried or cursed him for deceiving her. Yet Sophia studied his failing ranch with the intense focus of someone taking inventory as if she were diagnosing an illness. She wasn't looking at the failure. She was looking for the cause. The house looked even smaller and shabbier than he remembered. Paint peeled from the shutters like sunburnt skin. The porch sagged on one side, a tired sigh frozen in wood. Sophia climbed down from the wagon without waiting for his help and smoothed her skirts, treating the humble dwelling as if it were a palace she was considering purchasing. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "The arrangement stands as written in your letter," she stated, not asked. Her directness surprised him. "Room, board, and a small wage for helping with ranch work." He nodded dumbly. "Then I accept." She lifted her single, surprisingly heavy bag from the wagon bed and walked toward the house as if she owned it. Lawson followed, a step behind, completely bewildered, uncertain whether to feel relieved or absolutely terrified. He had a feeling he'd just invited a storm into his house, and he didn't know if it would be the kind that brings cleansing rain or the kind that tears everything apart. The next morning brought fresh disasters, as if the land itself was testing her resolve. 3 more cattle had died overnight, their bodies stiff in the pale dawn light. The vegetable garden showed signs of a strange blight he couldn't identify. The leaves of the tomato plants curled in black. Worse, the general store refused to deliver his usual supplies. A boy had ridden out with a note from Martha Jennings, its message clear and cold. Decent folk wouldn't be doing business with his household anymore. The town had drawn its line in the sand. He was on the other side now, with her. Sophia emerged from the house wearing a simple, practical work dress. She'd pinned her hair back severely and rolled up her sleeves, revealing strong, capable forearms. Without a word, she walked directly to the dead cattle. She didn't recoil from the sight or the smell. Instead, she began examining them, lifting their eyelids, checking their mouths and gums with a clinical, detached precision that made Lawson uneasy. "When did the deaths start?" she asked, her voice steady. "2 weeks ago," he mumbled. "Lost 12 head so far." She moved to the surviving animals, the ones still on their feet, running her hands along their flanks and necks. Several cattle that had seemed healthy just yesterday now appeared listless, their heads hanging low. She spent a full hour methodically examining the herd while Lawson watched, a growing sense of confusion warring with his despair. What was she looking for? What could she possibly see that he hadn't? The crisis came that afternoon, swift and devastating. Thunder, his prize bull and the entire foundation of his breeding program, collapsed in the pasture. The massive animal, worth more than the rest of the herd combined, lay on its side, white foam flecking its muzzle. His breathing came in ragged, desperate gasps. Panic seized Lawson. This was it, the final blow. Without Thunder, there was no future for the ranch. He ran toward town, his boots kicking up dust, desperate to fetch the veterinarian. Doc Peterson had treated ranch animals in this county for 20 years. Surely he'd make an exception for an emergency like this. He had to. He found Peterson outside his office, loading supplies into his wagon. The older man's face, usually friendly, hardened into a mask of stone when he saw Lawson approaching. "Don't bother asking, Lawson," Peterson said before he could even speak. "I won't set foot on your place while that woman's there." Lawson's blood ran cold. "Thunder's dying, Doc. He's worth more than my whole herd combined." "Should have thought of that before you brought shame to this town," Peterson replied, not even looking at him. He climbed onto his wagon and drove away without a backward glance. Lawson stood alone in the dusty street, watching his last hope disappear. Other townspeople emerged from shops and doorways, their faces showing a sick mixture of pity and satisfaction. He was truly an outcast now. He rode back to the ranch, a hollow feeling in his gut, expecting to find Thunder dead. Instead, he saw Sophia kneeling beside the massive bull, her sleeves rolled even higher. She had opened a leather satchel he hadn't noticed before, and it was filled with glass vials, metal instruments, and neatly wrapped bandages. Her hands moved with a practiced, efficient speed, drawing blood samples into a thin glass tube and examining the animal's eyes with a small, bright light. She didn't look up as he approached. Hold his head steady. Her voice was pure command. There was no room for argument. Lawson dropped to his knees, his despair momentarily forgotten, and cradled Thunder's massive head in his lap. The bull's breathing had worsened. The foam around his mouth now turned pink with blood. This was the end. Sophia filled a syringe from one of her vials, the needle glinting in the sun. She found a vein in Thunder's thick neck with an expert touch and injected the contents with a steady hand. Then she prepared a second injection, this one much larger. What are you doing? Lawson breathed, his voice barely a whisper. Saving your bull, she said without looking at him. She administered the second injection, then began mixing a dark powder with water in a metal cup. The liquid smelled sharp and medicinal. Hold his mouth open. Together, they poured it down Thunder's throat. The bull struggled weakly, then lay still. You need to move the entire herd to the north pasture immediately, she said, wiping her hands on a clean cloth from her bag. Burn everything in this field. The water trough, the feed, all of it. Lawson stared at her, his mind reeling. How do you know what's wrong with him? She finally looked at him, her dark eyes piercing and direct. Because I'm a veterinarian. The words hit him like a physical blow. He stared at her calm, focused face, trying to process this impossible revelation. A woman veterinarian? A black woman veterinarian? It was unthinkable. That's not possible, he stammered. I studied at the Boston College of Veterinary Medicine, she said, her voice even and clear as she continued working, checking Thunder's pulse and breathing. Graduated top of my class 3 years ago. She spoke the words as if she were discussing the weather, but they were the most shocking thing he had ever heard. The bull's gasping had eased slightly. A little color returned to his pale gums. I came west because Eastern society wouldn't let me practice freely. Too many barriers, too many men who couldn't accept a woman with medical training. Lawson's mind raced, trying to catch up. He'd advertised for a plain farm wife. He'd received a trained professional, a doctor, hiding in plain sight. The irony would have been funny if his entire future hadn't been hanging in the balance. Your herd has ergot poisoning, she stated, her tone leaving no room for doubt. From contaminated grain. Without immediate treatment, you'll lose them all within a week. Just then, Thunder's breathing steadied. The foam around his muzzle cleared. His eyes lost their glassy, panicked look. The injections will counteract the poison, but you must change their diet completely and disinfect everything they've touched. She packed her instruments back into the leather satchel with the same methodical precision. Lawson noticed her hands remained perfectly steady, despite what she had just accomplished. Where did you learn to do all this? He asked, his voice filled with a new kind of awe. Boston General Hospital, she replied. I worked there 2 years before heading west. Before he could ask another question, Thunder let out a low groan, lifted his massive head and looked around. The improvement was nothing short of miraculous. An hour ago, the bull had been dying. Now he was struggling to his feet, shaky but undeniably alive. Word of the miracle spread through town like a grass fire. By evening, 3 of his neighbors had ridden over, their curiosity overriding their prejudice, to see the recovered bull with their own eyes. They found Sophia directing the burning of the contaminated feed, while Lawson, following her every instruction, moved his herd to a clean pasture. She hadn't just saved Thunder. She had identified the poison that was threatening his entire operation, a problem Doc Peterson had completely missed. The woman he'd expected to be a burden, a source of shame, had just become his salvation. And suddenly he knew the trouble in Cedar Ridge was just beginning. Sophia transformed the ranch within weeks. It was like watching an artist bring a dead canvas to life. She implemented rotational grazing patterns he'd only read about in fancy Eastern journals, allowing the overworked pastures to recover. The surviving cattle grew stronger on fresh grass and clean water. She walked the fields every morning, crumbling soil between her fingers. She identified mineral deficiencies and suggested amendments that would improve his crop yields, explaining the science behind it in a way that was simple and clear. Lawson watched her work with a growing, humbling amazement. She approached every problem with a scientific precision that was both fascinating and intimidating. Her leather journal, which she carried everywhere, filled with meticulous notes about soil composition, weather patterns, and animal behavior. She treated ranching like medicine, diagnosing the problem, prescribing the solution, and monitoring the results. She showed him that the drought had damaged more than just his land. Years of his own poor practices had depleted the soil and contaminated his water sources. Together, they dug proper drainage ditches and planned a crop rotation to restore vital nutrients to the exhausted earth. She even designed a simple but ingenious water conservation system that caught and stored every precious drop of rain. Her veterinary skills proved invaluable far beyond Thunder's recovery. She treated a neighbor's horse for colic when Doc Peterson was conveniently out of town. Word spread quietly among the other ranchers. A man would ride up to the fence line, looking around nervously, and ask a hypothetical question about a sick calf. Sophia would give her advice freely, without asking for anything in return. Martha Jennings, the storekeeper's wife, was the first to approach directly. Her prize milk cow had stopped producing after a difficult calving. She arrived at dawn, her face a mixture of desperation and shame, looking around nervously before knocking on the door. "I heard what she did for your bull," she whispered, unable to meet Lawson's eyes. Sophia examined the cow without fanfare. She diagnosed a retained placenta, a common but dangerous complication, and administered a treatment that had the animal producing milk again within 2 days. Martha Jennings didn't say thank you, but she left a large basket of fresh bread and preserves on the porch as payment. The preacher's wife came next. Her prize rooster had developed a strange limp that threatened his ability to service the hens, a small disaster for their egg business. Sophia's examination revealed a simple nutritional deficiency. A change in diet restored the bird's vigor completely. Each small success was a victory, but it was also a threat. Clayton Wade noticed the increased activity around Lawson's ranch. He saw the neighbors coming and going. He saw the land turning from brown to a pale, hopeful green. He rode over one afternoon, his face dark with suspicion. He found Sophia treating a neighbor's sheep for parasites while Lawson was nearby, repairing fence posts. "Folks are saying she's some kind of animal doctor," Wade said, his voice laced with contempt. "She knows her business," Lawson replied, not looking up from his work. "No woman knows doctoring," Wade sneered. "Especially not her kind." Lawson's hands tightened on the fence post, the wood groaning under the pressure. "Her kind saved my herd when your friend Peterson wouldn't even come look." Wade's voice turned threatening. "You're making a mistake, Hargrove. A big mistake. This town won't stand for it much longer." That very night, someone cut the fence around Lawson's north pasture. His cattle, the ones Sophia had worked so hard to save, wandered onto the road, creating chaos until dawn. It took them the entire morning to round them up. Sophia examined the cut wire. "This is too clean to be accidental," she said, her voice grim. "Someone used proper wire cutters and took their time to ensure maximum damage, and it was a clear message." 2 days later, several feed sacks in the barn showed signs of tampering. Sophia, ever cautious, tested samples before feeding the herd. She found traces of salt deliberately mixed into the grain. Not enough to kill them outright, but enough to make them sick, to dehydrate them in the brutal heat. Only her careful inspection had prevented another disaster. The harassment escalated gradually, a campaign of 1,000 cuts. Tools disappeared from the barn. Gates were mysteriously left open. Strange noises in the night spooked the cattle, leaving them exhausted and agitated. Sophia documented everything in her journal, noting the patterns, the timing, the methods. It suggested organized sabotage, not random mischief. This wasn't just about prejudice anymore. Someone was actively trying to destroy him. Lawson's anger grew with each incident. He'd expected social disapproval, whispers and cold shoulders. He hadn't expected this deliberate, malicious campaign to ruin him. These weren't pranks or warnings. Someone wanted him gone. The confrontation came on a Saturday morning. Wade arrived with 5 other ranchers, their faces grim with purpose. They rode into his yard as if they owned it. They found Lawson and Sophia working together to repair storm damage from the previous night's rain, a partnership that now felt as natural as breathing. "We've come to talk some sense into you, Hargrove," Wade announced from his horse. "Then you've wasted your time," Lawson said, stepping forward. "This has gone too far," one of the other men chimed in. "She's got half the county thinking she's some kind of miracle worker." Sophia continued her work, her face calm and unreadable despite the obvious hostility. She had learned to ignore such confrontations during her years in Boston. Men like Wade existed everywhere, their fragile pride threatened by competence they couldn't understand or control. "Look at what she's accomplished here," Lawson said, his voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even himself. "My cattle are healthy. My land is recovering. That's more than any of you managed during this drought." "It's not natural," Wade spat. "Women don't doctor animals, and women like her certainly don't tell white men how to run their ranches." The words hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Lawson felt something shift inside him, a line being crossed that he could never uncross. "She saved more animals in 2 months than Peterson has all year," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "If that threatens you, the problem isn't with her. It's with you." Wade's face reddened with fury. "You're choosing her over your own kind. I'm choosing competence over prejudice." "Then you're a fool," Wade snarled. "This town won't tolerate much more of this nonsense." "The town," Lawson said, the words tasting of freedom, "can go to hell." The words surprised Lawson as much as they did Wade. He'd never spoken so boldly, never taken such a definitive stand in his life. But something about Sophia's quiet dignity in the face of this ugliness had awakened his own sleeping courage. Wade's group exchanged uncertain glances. They had expected him to cave under the pressure, to send Sophia away rather than face community rejection. His defiance had changed the entire equation. "You'll regret this, Hargrove," Wade said, his voice a low promise. "Mark my words." They rode away in a cloud of dust and implied threats, leaving a heavy silence hanging in the morning air. Sophia finally looked up from her work, her eyes meeting Lawson's. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Yes," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "I did." That evening, they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple. For the first time since Martha's death, Lawson felt something other than grief and desperation. He felt hope. The ranch was recovering. The woman beside him had brought both healing and hope. But Wade's warning echoed in his mind. The confrontation had drawn battle lines neither of them could erase. Whatever came next would test both their resolve and their rapidly deepening partnership. The stakes had just risen beyond simple survival. Now they faced a choice between safety and principle, between conformity and courage. And Lawson knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that Wade's war was far from over. The letters arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a nervous young postal clerk who wouldn't meet Sophia's eyes. She recognized the official Denver postmark immediately, her heart giving a painful lurch. Her hands trembled slightly as she tucked the thick envelope inside her apron, away from Lawson's curious gaze. She waited until evening, until the house was quiet and the lamps were lit, to read it in the privacy of her small room. The first letter bore the letterhead of the Denver Tribune, Colorado's most respected newspaper. They had been investigating her former employer, the celebrated Dr. Marcus Whitmore, following anonymous tips from several of her old colleagues in Boston. The investigation had uncovered years of academic fraud. Whitmore, it turned out, had built his entire reputation on stealing research from his students and junior colleagues, particularly women who had no power to challenge him publicly. The theft charges against Sophia, the ones that had forced her to flee west, had been completely fabricated. He'd invented them to silence her when she'd threatened to expose his plagiarism of her groundbreaking work on bovine diseases. She was not a fugitive. She was a victim. A second letter, enclosed with the first, contained even more shocking news. The Tribune wanted to publish her original veterinary research under her own name, a multi-part series that would give her the credit she had been denied. And they offered her a position, a full-time job as their first female science correspondent, documenting agricultural innovations across the vast Colorado territory. Sophia stared at the papers until the words blurred. Everything she had ever dreamed of, everything she had worked for, was finally within her reach. Recognition for her work, professional vindication, a chance to practice her skills without hiding or making excuses. But accepting it meant leaving the ranch. It meant leaving Lawson. The sabotage intensified that same week. as if Wade could sense her wavering. Someone poisoned the well water with salt, making it undrinkable for the livestock. They were forced to spend 2 days hauling fresh water bucket by bucket from the creek a mile away. The feed bags in the barn were slashed open, spilling precious grain across the dirt floor where it was ruined. Gate hinges were systematically loosened so the cattle could push through and scatter across the open range. It was a constant, draining assault. Sophia approached each new incident like a medical case, documenting the evidence, analyzing the patterns. The perpetrators worked systematically, targeting different aspects of the operation each night. They weren't just vandals. They knew ranching well enough to cause maximum disruption with minimal effort. "It's not random," she told Lawson over a grim breakfast of stale bread and coffee. "Someone is trying to make the ranch fail slowly, to bleed us dry. It has to be Wade." "Can you prove it?" Lawson asked, his face etched with exhaustion. His silence was her answer. In a small town, everyone knew everyone else's business, but knowing and proving were two entirely different things. The harassment began to affect their few remaining allies. Martha Jennings faced a boycott from customers who disapproved of her quiet friendship with Sophia. The preacher received a formal complaint from the church elders about allowing that woman to attend Sunday services. Even Doc Peterson, who had snubbed them, felt the pressure for his refusal to treat Lawson's animals, as it made him look petty and incompetent now that Sophia's skills were becoming legendary. Sophia's clandestine evening treatments of neighborhood livestock continued despite the controversy. She became a creature of the night, working by lamplight in barns and sheds, arriving after dark and leaving before dawn to protect the ranchers who sought her help. Her reputation spread beyond Cedar Ridge, whispered from one desperate farmer to another. But her success only fueled Wade's resentment. He convinced the town council to launch an official investigation into whether Sophia was practicing medicine without a proper territorial license. Sheriff Collins made a few half-hearted inquiries, but found no laws on the books specifically preventing veterinary treatment by an unlicensed individual. The law simply hadn't contemplated a woman like Sophia Reed. Late one night, Lawson found Sophia sitting on the porch steps, staring up at the blanket of stars. The Tribune letters were in her lap, creased and worn from countless readings. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice carrying a weight that made his stomach clench. He'd grown to depend on her steady presence, her quiet confidence in the face of every crisis. The thought of her leaving was a physical pain. "I wasn't entirely truthful about why I left Boston." She told him everything. About Dr. Whitmore, the stolen research, the false charges that had branded her a thief and forced her to flee. She explained how her mentor, a man she had trusted implicitly, had promised to protect her career, only to betray that trust to advance his own reputation. "I came west because I thought I was a fugitive," she confessed, her voice thick with emotion. "I believed those charges would follow me forever." The Tribune investigation had cleared her name completely. Whitmore was facing criminal charges and academic disgrace. Her name was known now, respected. Several prestigious universities wanted to offer her research positions. The scientific community, once closed to her, now recognized her work as groundbreaking. "They're offering me everything I've ever wanted," she whispered, the words hanging between them in the cool night air. Lawson absorbed this revelation in stunned silence. The woman he'd thought was desperate and hiding, the woman he had saved, had actually been vindicated by the most respected newspaper in Colorado. She wasn't an outcast. She was a pioneer. She could have any career she chose, anywhere she wanted. "When do you leave?" he asked, the words tasting like poison. "I haven't decided yet." But her hesitation, the way she clutched the letters, told him everything. This was the opportunity she had sacrificed everything to earn. He couldn't ask her to give it up for a struggling ranch and a grieving widower. The next morning brought a new wave of disasters. Someone had cut the irrigation ditches, flooding the north pasture, and drowning the tender new grass she had worked so hard to cultivate. The chicken coop showed signs of a forced entry, though bizarrely nothing was stolen. Tools were scattered across the yard as if thrown from the barn loft in a fit of rage. Sophia documented everything with her usual thoroughness. She measured footprints, analyzed the damage patterns, and cataloged the missing items. Her scientific approach revealed details that casual observation would have missed. 3 different people did this, she announced, pointing to the distinct boot prints in the mud. The footprints don't match. One person cut the ditches, another one ransacked the barn, a third disturbed the chickens. This isn't just Wade anymore. He's organized a campaign. He's trying to drive up our costs and our labor while destroying our reputation. If we can't maintain the ranch properly, we'll lose credibility with the other ranchers. The strategy was working. Several neighbors canceled their secret appointments for animal treatment, too afraid to be associated with them. The general store began losing their supply orders. Even the loyal Martha Jennings grew nervous, her visits becoming shorter and less frequent. Sophia faced an impossible choice: stay and fight a battle that might destroy both of their futures, or accept the vindication and success that would take her away from the man she was realizing she had grown to love. The Tribune wanted an answer within the week. Wade's harassment showed no signs of stopping, and Lawson watched her with a growing, terrible sadness, knowing she had to leave. He knew he had to be the one to tell her to go. Wade delivered his ultimatum on a Friday morning. He didn't come with his usual cronies. This time, he rode up to the house with Sheriff Collins in tow. Wade's face was set with grim, triumphant satisfaction. The sheriff looked deeply uncomfortable, but he stayed mounted just behind Wade's shoulder, a clear sign he was there on official business. 24 hours, Hargrove, Wade said, his voice ringing with authority. Either she's gone by tomorrow night, or you'll face the consequences. Lawson stepped out onto the porch, his hand resting near the stock of the rifle he now kept propped against the doorframe. What consequences would those be, Wade? Legal action, Wade said with a smirk. I've filed official complaints. Unlicensed medical practice, public nuisance. The circuit judge arrives on the stage Monday morning. He'll hear the case first thing. Sheriff Collins shifted in his saddle. The complaints are official, Lawson. My hands are tied. I have to investigate. Investigate what? Lawson shot back. Healing sick animals? Operating outside the law, Wade corrected him. Practicing veterinary medicine without proper territorial licensing. No judge will side with you once he hears the full story. A decent woman wouldn't be living unmarried with a man, treating animals like some kind of witch doctor. The words hung in the air like a foul poison. Lawson felt his temper rising, a hot surge of rage, but he forced himself to stay calm. Losing control now would only strengthen Wade's position, prove his point. The Tribune expects my answer by Monday, Sophia said quietly from the doorway. Her voice cut through the tension. Perhaps that's for the best. Wade's eyes narrowed with suspicion. What's the Tribune got to do with anything? They've offered me a position, Sophia said, her voice steady and proud. In Denver. The revelation clearly surprised Wade. He had built his entire campaign on the assumption that she was a desperate woman with no options, no place to go. Learning about her professional opportunities disrupted his carefully planned confrontation. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. Then take it, he sneered, recovering quickly, and spare us all this nonsense. After they rode away, Lawson and Sophia sat in heavy silence on the porch swing. The ultimatum had forced a decision neither of them was ready to make. She could leave with her head held high, stepping into a life of success and respect. Or she could stay and face a rigged legal battle that might destroy them both. The offer is too good to refuse, Lawson said finally, his voice rough. You'd be a fool to stay here. Would I? Her quiet question carried 1,000 deeper meanings. They had both felt the connection growing between them, a partnership that had evolved far beyond mere convenience into something deep and essential. But love, he reminded himself, couldn't overcome the practical, brutal realities they faced. I won't ask you to sacrifice your career for this place. For me. What if I want to sacrifice it? The confession hung between them, heavy with possibility and pain. Lawson reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining naturally, a perfect fit. I love you, Sophia, he whispered, the words he'd thought he'd never say again. But I can't protect you from what's coming. She squeezed his hand, her strength flowing into him. Then we face it together. Saturday brought a flurry of activity. Wade had spread word of the ultimatum and the coming judge, dividing the town into two opposing camps. Some loudly supported his position, viewing Sophia's presence as a threat to the proper social order. But others, the ones she had helped in secret, quietly admired her competence and began to question Wade's true motives. Martha Jennings arrived at noon, her face pale with worry, carrying a basket of bread and some urgent news. "Lawson, you have to know," she said in a hushed voice. "The circuit judge, Judge Franklin, he's Clayton Wade's brother-in-law." The information landed like a physical blow. Their worst fears were confirmed. Wade hadn't just filed complaints, he had rigged the entire outcome from the start. They were facing a legal battle they could not possibly win through conventional means. "There might be another way," Sophia said thoughtfully, her mind already working, analyzing this new problem. "The journalist from the Tribune, the one who wrote about my case, he's traveling through Colorado, documenting territorial politics." She had maintained a correspondence with James Morrison, the dogged reporter who had investigated Dr. Whitmore. He was currently in Denver, researching a series on corruption in the territorial courts, a story about judicial bias, racial prejudice, and a powerful man trying to crush a scientific pioneer would be exactly the kind of story he'd be interested in. They sent a telegram that afternoon, a desperate shot in the dark, outlining their situation and Wade's connections to the circuit judge. Morrison's response came within hours. It was short and to the point. He would be on the Sunday night train. "Public scrutiny changes everything," Sophia explained, a spark of hope in her eyes. "Wade can control local opinion, but he can't manipulate a newspaper with statewide circulation." Saturday night, they talked until dawn, not about strategies or legal tactics, but about their lives, their feelings, their fears. Lawson described his marriage to Martha, the beautiful life they had built, and how grief had nearly destroyed him after her death. Sophia shared her struggles in Boston, the constant, draining battle to prove her competence in a man's profession, the sting of betrayal, the loneliness of her flight west. "I never expected to find this," she said, gesturing to the quiet ranch around them. "A place where I could use my skills without apology." "Even with all the trouble it's caused?" he asked. "Especially because of the trouble," she replied. "Standing up for something worthwhile, it makes it more precious." Sunday brought unexpected support. As word of the rigged hearing spread, ranchers from neighboring counties began arriving in town. Many had only heard rumors of Sophia's veterinary work, but they were drawn by the principle of the thing. A man's land was his own, and no one, not even Clayton Wade, had the right to run someone out through lies and intimidation. Their presence suggested the case now had implications far beyond Cedar Ridge. Morrison arrived on the evening train as promised, a thin, energetic man with sharp eyes and a notebook that seemed permanently attached to his hand. He interviewed Sophia for hours, meticulously documenting her credentials, the sabotage she'd endured, and Wade's campaign against her. He seemed particularly interested in Wade's financial interests and political connections. "Corruption makes good copy," he told them with a wry smile, "especially when it involves suppressing scientific progress for personal gain." Monday morning dawned clear and cold. The small courthouse filled beyond capacity with ranchers, townspeople, and curious observers from distant settlements. Clayton Wade looked confident, almost smug, until he noticed Morrison's prominent presence in the front row. Then he saw the dozens of unfamiliar, unfriendly faces in the crowd, and his smile faltered. Judge Franklin Wade, Clayton's brother-in-law, took the bench with obvious irritation. He had clearly expected a simple local matter, not a packed courtroom, with a reporter from the Denver Tribune documenting his every word. Morrison sat ready, his pencil moving constantly across his notepad. The moment of truth had arrived. Sophia faced a choice between accepting a brilliant career in Denver or fighting for her right to practice, to live, to love, right here in Cedar Ridge. The packed courtroom waited for her decision. Whatever happened next would determine not just their futures, but set a precedent for every woman, every outsider, who dared to seek professional recognition in the territorial courts. The air crackled with tension. The show was about to begin. Judge Franklin Wade called the court to order, his gavel striking the wood with a sound that seemed too loud in the silent room. His eyes darted nervously from his brother-in-law to the reporter in the front row, whose pencil was already scratching furiously across his notepad. What should have been a simple, private favor had become a very public spectacle. Clayton Wade presented his case with the polished confidence of a man who believes he has already won. He argued that unlicensed medical practice threatened public safety. He painted Sophia as an unqualified, dangerous fraud, taking advantage of desperate ranchers with folk remedies and witchcraft. His witnesses, a hand-picked selection of his own ranch hands and business associates, testified about the importance of proper licensing procedures and territorial regulations. This woman, Wade declared, pointing a dramatic finger at Sophia, has no legal authority to treat animals in the Colorado Territory. Her presence undermines legitimate, trained veterinary practitioners and endangers the livestock throughout this entire region. Judge Wade nodded approvingly throughout the presentation. His bias was so obvious it was almost comical. Morrison documented every gesture, every leading question, every instance of blatant judicial favoritism. When it was Sophia's turn, she rose with a quiet dignity that commanded the room's attention. Instead of launching into a defense of her qualifications, she did something completely unexpected. She called her first witness. I called Thomas Miller, cattle rancher from Pueblo County. A weathered man with kind eyes stood from the gallery. He had ridden for 3 days to be here. He testified in a clear, strong voice about the prize-winning mare Sophia had saved from a severe case of colic during her initial journey west. Doc Peterson from my own town said she was a lost cause, Miller stated. Miss Reed here stayed up with her for 2 nights straight. Without her intervention, I would have lost my most valuable breeding stock. Next, she called another name. I call Samuel Hendricks from Grand Junction. Another rancher stood and testified about a flock of sheep Sophia had treated for a deadly parasite infestation, saving his entire flock from certain destruction. His detailed, grateful account directly contradicted Wade's claims about her endangering livestock. One by one, ranchers from across the Colorado Territory took the stand. They had all heard about the hearing and had come of their own accord. Each told a similar story of professional competence, of compassion, of successful treatments where licensed veterinarians had failed. Their collective testimony painted Sophia not as a dangerous fraud, but as a skilled and dedicated practitioner whose work had saved them thousands of dollars and countless beloved animals. Martha Jennings testified about her milk cow. The preacher's wife described her rooster's miraculous recovery. Even Sheriff Collins, when called to the stand by Sophia, was forced to admit under oath that not a single complaint had ever been filed about Sophia's treatments until Clayton Wade began his personal campaign. Wade's face darkened with fury as witness after witness chipped away at his carefully constructed narrative. He had expected a simple character assassination of a frightened, friendless woman. He had not anticipated a parade of satisfied, influential customers praising her expertise. I object to this circus, he shouted, jumping to his feet. These people are simple farmers. They aren't qualified to judge veterinary competence. Sophia smiled calmly, a small, knowing smile that made Wade's blood boil. Then perhaps, she said, her voice ringing through the silent courtroom, you'd like to hear from someone who is. She produced a portfolio from her satchel. From it, she withdrew her diploma from the Boston College of Veterinary Medicine, her license to practice in the state of Massachusetts, and glowing letters of recommendation from 3 of the most prominent veterinarians on the East Coast. Morrison had helped her gather additional, notarized documentation via telegraph correspondence in Boston. The papers were passed through the courtroom like wildfire. Ranchers who could barely read their own names examined the official seals and embossed stamps with a sense of reverence. Here in their hands was undeniable proof. Their faith in Sophia's abilities had been justified. Judge Wade, sweating now under the scrutiny, tried to dismiss the credentials as irrelevant to territorial law. But before he could, James Morrison stood and addressed the court directly. Your Honor, he said, his voice carrying the weight of his newspaper, I'm James Morrison of the Denver Tribune. I am documenting this case for statewide publication. I am certain the territorial residents of Colorado will be very interested to know how their courts handle matters of professional competence. judicial impartiality, and civil rights. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Any obvious bias would be reported across the entire Colorado territory. Judge Wade's comfortable, corrupt little world was suddenly in danger of collapsing. Finally, Sophia took the stand in her own defense. She described her education methodically, detailing her courses in anatomy, pharmacology, pathology, and advanced surgical techniques. She explained her research into livestock diseases, research that was now being published under her name in prestigious Eastern veterinary journals. I came west seeking the freedom to practice my profession without the artificial barriers of prejudice, she said, her eyes sweeping across the rapt faces in the courtroom. I have harmed no one, and I have helped many. The only crime I have committed is challenging the assumptions about what a woman, and a black woman, can accomplish. Clayton Wade cross-examined her aggressively, trying to portray her as an arrogant, uppity outsider who was disrupting the harmony of their community. But his every attack only served to highlight her dignity, her intelligence, and her unshakable competence. The packed courtroom watched as a respected, powerful businessman tried, and failed, to bully a woman whose only offense was her own professional excellence. The tide of opinion in the room had turned completely against him. Then came the final, devastating blow. Sophia announced her decision about the Tribune's job offer. The Denver Tribune has generously offered me a position as their territorial science correspondent, she announced. I would travel throughout Colorado, documenting the agricultural innovations that will build the future of this great state, helping all ranchers improve their practices. She paused, letting the weight of the statement settle. I intend to accept this position, she continued, while maintaining my private veterinary practice right here in Cedar Ridge. Morrison nodded his confirmation from the front row. The offer was real, prestigious, and generous. Sophia would gain statewide recognition while continuing her local work. It was a perfect solution that satisfied everyone, except Wade and his brother-in-law. Judge Wade found himself trapped. He was caught between his family loyalty to Clayton and the intense public scrutiny of a reporter known for exposing corruption. Ruling against Sophia now would be a political and social suicide. It would appear vindictive, corrupt, and utterly foolish. Morrison's presence guaranteed that any obvious injustice would become front-page news from Denver to Durango. The judge cleared his throat, his face pale. This court finds no evidence of public endangerment or fraudulent practice, he mumbled, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. The complaints are dismissed. The courtroom erupted in cheers. Ranchers who'd traveled hundreds of miles to testify surrounded Sophia, shaking her hand, clapping her on the back. Even some of Wade's former supporters seemed relieved by the outcome. Clayton Wade stormed from the courthouse, his face a mask of rage and public humiliation. His campaign against Sophia had backfired spectacularly, revealing him not as a pillar of the community, but as a petty, prejudiced, and vindictive bully. His political ambitions in Cedar Ridge were ruined. That evening, Lawson found Sophia on the porch where their unlikely partnership had begun just months earlier. The legal victory had secured her right to practice, but deep questions still remained about their personal future. The Tribune position means you'll have to travel, he said quietly, throughout the territory. You'll be gone for weeks at a time. We'll make it work, she said, her voice soft but firm. There's something else, she added, turning to face him directly, her eyes shining in the twilight. They want my first series of articles to be about the founding of the first female-owned veterinary practice in the Colorado Territory. Our practice, here. She emphasized the last word. That means staying here, permanently, not just until something better comes along. Lawson understood the implication in her words. She was choosing him. She was choosing Cedar Ridge. She was choosing this hard, beautiful life they had started to build together over safer, easier opportunities elsewhere. The decision humbled and thrilled him in a way he couldn't put into words. Then I guess, he said, his voice thick with emotion, I should make this official. He dropped to one knee on the rough porch wood, pulling from his pocket a simple gold band that had belonged to his grandmother. He'd been carrying it for weeks, waiting for the right moment. Will you marry me, Dr. Sophia Reed? Her joyful, tearful acceptance sealed more than just their personal commitment. It represented a victory for progress over prejudice, for competence over convention, for love over hate. Their wedding 3 months later drew guests from across the territory, including several other unconventional couples who had found the courage in Sophia and Lawson's story to follow their own paths. The ranch prospered under their combined management. Sophia's articles in the Tribune brought national attention to Colorado's agricultural innovations, with the Hargrove Ranch often cited as a prime example of modern techniques. Their success inspired other educated women to seek opportunities in the growing territory, creating a small but vibrant community of professionals in Cedar Ridge. Years later, when other interracial couples faced hostility in neighboring towns, they often found refuge, support, and a helping hand in the town that had once tried to cast Sophia out. Sophia and Lawson's courage had planted seeds of tolerance and acceptance that grew into a lasting legacy, changing their small corner of the West forever. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of justice and unexpected heroes.